Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm giving you some of my top tips on how to become a better psychic reader. Now, this is not just for those of you who are readers yourselves and you have like your own clients. This is also for those of you who maybe just are reading yourselves or maybe you're just reading like friends and family at the most. So there's still tips in here for you. And these are kind of like all of my tips of where I think most people can improve their intuitive abilities and just be better readers in general. Now, these tips are basically things that I think you can use to get to that next level as a reader. And so I'm assuming that you kind of know the basics, know kind of how to work your clairs and how to do those readings. So if you're struggling, like go back to the basics first, but this is kind of things you can still keep in mind as you're learning, or even if you're an experienced reader and you just feel like you could be doing a little bit better in general. Now, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Lauren. I'm a psychic, I'm a medium, I'm an animal communicator. I've been doing readings for about 7-8 years now, and I've also been teaching a lot of people both privately on my channel and as a coach when I was back at the Aspen program. And so these are things that I feel like, often people develop bad habits around, and it's something that we might not know is a bad thing, but can actually hinder us from really connecting with our psychic abilities in the best way possible. I will say also that if you want to learn more on how to be a reader and how to start a business that way, definitely check out my basic psychic skills course. Once you get to part 3, which is kind of the ending of the course, I go pretty in depth on how to have a psychic business, also like the types of clients you might encounter and how you can deal with them, as well as like what to do when you just feel like all your readings start to feel the same. It's kind of that more advanced stuff for those of you who have been reading for a while. So check that out if you feel like you just kind of like my tips and want to see more. Now, when I give these tips, I'm just going to assume that you're reading somebody else, just to kind of keep it the same. But if you are reading yourself, just know that you can change kind of what I'm saying, and the basic principle will still apply. So the first tip that I want to give is basically knowing when to specify that, hey, the information that I'm giving you right now is not psychic. And sometimes I see this happen a lot, especially like in pick a card readings and online, and basically somebody is starting to give like counseling left brain, Lauren advice versus an intuitive right brain, this is coming to me advice. And I think where this issue lies is that a lot of people don't know that difference. They don't know the difference between intuitive hits coming through versus non-intuitive hits and like your counseling and your advice. And I have a whole video on this because I think it's a pretty big thing that they'll get a psychic hit, but then they'll start to go back into their left brain and analyze and counsel from there, when really all of that information should be coming from your intuition. It's always coming from your intuition. Again, that doesn't mean you can't like use stories and use your analytical advice here and there, but again, you have to specify, hey, this is me talking versus this is the intuition or your guide or whoever you're talking to, that psychic source. You really have to make that differentiation. A lot of people, when they get psychic readings, they don't know that psychics can be wrong. They don't know that sometimes they don't have to take that advice. And when they put so much weight on your words, it's important especially when you're counseling and not giving real intuitive hits that are coming through, to really specify, hey, this is my personal opinion, this is what I think you should do. So really try to make the distinction. Just say in the middle of the reading, hey, this is my advice, this is Lauren advice, is usually what I say. And then when I'm jumping back into it and getting that intuitive information, I usually say, okay, intuitively what's coming to me, or this is intuitive, just so that people can understand, okay, this is Lauren versus this is not Lauren. And a lot of people kind of blend that together, and sometimes people will purely just be giving their advice, and maybe only a percentage of it was actually psychic. So really try to make that difference, and it also helps you to know, oh, okay, this is left brain, oh, this is right brain. So this next tip I have is probably my biggest, I feel like it's a top secret tip. But I want to give it to you guys because I want to make us all better as a collective industry. I want us all to really be better psychic readers. That's, the whole point of my channel here is I really want us to become better psychics, better intuitive readers, so that people start to take us more seriously and this industry is not so like looked down upon because of those bad apples, the people who do it wrong. And so this tip is something that I got from my mentor, and I love it, and it has just made a world of difference to this day. And that is to make statements and not questions in your readings. So let me give an example. I'm going to pretend like I'm reading someone, and this someone wants to connect to their grandmother. And so what I could do, which is a question, to validate, oh, hey, am I talking to the right person? I could say, hey, was your grandma short? Did your grandmother have red hair? See how that's a question? Now, instead, what I want you guys to try to do is start making statements. Start really trying to rely on that psychic ability and trust it by saying, your grandmother has red hair. Your grandmother is short. And see the difference in those statements? Really, at the core of it, it's all about confidence. And when you have more confidence in what you're saying, I find that people trust you more as a psychic versus if you take your whole reading to just basically ask question after question, it makes you sound like you don't know what you're talking about, or maybe just that you're not confident in what you're getting. And trust me, I still do this to this day. That's when I know my confidence in my own psychic ability is sort of like waning, is when I start to ask questions. But really, I've found when I make statements, people, like, I don't want to say like it blows their mind, but my confidence is what blows their mind. And I think because they're like, oh my gosh, the information was correct to begin with, but because she was so sure of it, it comes across a lot differently. So let's say worst case scenario, you're wrong. I mean, you're going to be wrong both ways. You're going to be wrong and not confident in asking kind of questions, or you're wrong and you were confident and you were kind of making a statement. But I think at the core here, people trust confidence a little bit. And when they're coming to you for a reading, they don't want to walk away being like, I don't know, she's kind of just felt like she didn't know what she was talking about. Like, I felt like that is kind of the takeaway from this. Like, when I go to readers who are constantly asking questions and questioning themselves, I feel like I'm not confident in their ability because they're not, if that makes sense. So really try to make statements. Try to shift into, does your grandma, really like cooking, into your grandma likes cooking, doesn't she? Well, I guess that's a question too. But your grandma really likes cooking. And again, if you're wrong, it doesn't matter. You might have been wrong even if you phrased it as a question. But I think it's something that builds your confidence in your psychic ability. But to the other person, it also comes across as like, I believe in what I'm doing, and if there's room for them to doubt you, then you're going to start to doubt yourself. I hope this makes sense, but I think that this is one of the most valuable tips I've ever gotten. Again, I still struggle with it. I'm sure some of you guys that have gotten readings from me are like, oh, she definitely asks questions. But I try really hard not to. I try to make statements instead. Now, the next tip I have for you is kind of similar, but this one is to make suggestions, not demands. We never want to tell somebody that they have to do something. And honestly, this is a huge turnoff for me when I go to another psychic and they say, you have to go do this. You have to change your career. You have to do this. Because it assumes that the person that you're reading has no free will. You have to understand that they have free will, that they're going to go off and do their own thing. Even if you feel so strongly that they need to do this, that's up to them. That's not your responsibility. And we'll get to that. That's basically another tip in itself. But I will give a quick example of this. I was at like a girls' night group years ago, and I saw somebody who was not an experienced psychic. She definitely connected, but she didn't have the boundaries, the ethics, any of that to understand how to give information correctly. And I watched her give somebody else at that party a reading, and she did only demands. You have to do this. You have to do that. You have to do this. And you're probably wondering, okay, how's that different than that first tip? This is about the advice. This is making sure that the advice is not you have to do this. It's more, hey, maybe look at doing this. I would suggest, your guides are suggesting to do this. I always preface this with, you have free will. You make the choice at the end of the day. Your guides will support you no matter which way you decide to go. Whereas the first tip is more about the information that's coming through. This is more about like, okay, actual advice giving. You know, your grandma was a cook versus you need to go buy this jacket is a very different type of information. One is just information, and one is like giving advice, if that makes sense. They're both intuitive, but we want to make sure, again, that we're giving suggestions and not demanding that anybody does anything. And going back to that example, what happened was, you know, and it was a very interesting experience to watch this girl give this other girl a reading, because I knew she was getting psychic information, but then she was using her left brain to counsel, and then on top of it, she was demanding that this person had to do something. And that friend texted me like a few days later and was like, oh my gosh, I've been so sad, so upset about this because she said that, and you know, it's got me all thrown off, and I feel like it didn't resonate, but I'm also feeling like I'm all off track now. And it made me so mad, because I was like, this person used this unethical thing and basically got in the mind of somebody who didn't know, you know, that she didn't have to listen to that advice. And because she was so certain, and because she was demanding things, you know, this other girl was feeling like she had to do these things or else, because that was the way the reader was kind of describing it. And I kind of like talked her through this all and was like, no, she did all of these things wrong, and on top of it, you have free will, you have a choice to make, and on top of it, like, if a reading that you have received does not resonate, throw it out. If a reading is truthful and resonates, you will feel it. Even if the information is hard to swallow, you will know if it's right. But again, as psychics, we have to remember that people don't always understand that. So it's very important not to tell them that they have to do anything. Really, we want to leave them empowered to make their own decisions. All right, this next tip, man, this one is hard for me, but I used it when I was learning, and my coach basically taught us to not close your eyes during readings. It's very easy to close your eyes and not look at the person the whole entire reading, because you're trying to tune into that psychic source. But think about it from your client's perspective. They're sitting here and somebody's got their eyes closed the whole time. They don't have anyone to connect with. And I think the same goes for you. You are not really connecting to their energy because your eyes are closed all the time. Now, this one is hard. Just try every now and then to really force yourself to do it. I think because I learned it from the beginning the right way, it's been a little bit easier for me. But every now and then I do, when I'm feeling really stuck, I do need to take a breath and close my eyes so that I can kind of disconnect from that person's energy, so that I can connect a little bit better. But just try to put yourself in their shoes. You know, if you're getting a reading from somebody who's just like, not even looking at you, it can be hard. It can be hard to open up your own energy so that they can read you. So this one is a hard one, and it is a habit that a lot of psychics have, but nobody's around really saying, hey, maybe don't do this. So try your best. I'm sure that some people will completely disagree with me and feel like they can only do readings with their eyes closed. I think it's hard when you've learned a certain way. It's very hard to unlearn it, but try to unlearn it and do it the right way if you can. I feel like these tips are so hard even for me, but again, I think that's what pushes you to be a better intuitive reader. And so this next one, I want to actually make a whole video on it, but I'm currently struggling with like how to put it into words. But this is about understanding, okay, what is your client's thoughts and what is psychic information? So sometimes I find that I'm accidentally picking up on the thoughts of the person that I'm reading versus the actual truth, if that makes sense. So the best example I could give is if somebody like lost their pet, they call me and I'm saying, oh, I feel like they got lost and scared and ran away and yada yada. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I was thinking that exact same thing. That's what I was worried about. And in those moments I have to be like, oh crap, am I just reading their thoughts? Am I reading their like hopes around the situation or their stresses around the situation? That can be a really hard one to distinguish, because sometimes you don't know until after, you know, you're like, oh crap, maybe that was them. And the best thing you can do in these moments is just be honest and be like, you know what, I think I might have been reading your thoughts, or you know what, let me double check that and go back to the intuitive source and say, hey, no, not reading this person's thoughts. You know, it's just like setting the intention of who you're going to talk to. Are you talking to a spirit? Are you talking to a guide? Are you talking to her thoughts? Are you talking to the animal? And you say, nope, I'm going to block this person out. If you need to, put up like a brick wall for a second and say, okay, what really happened here? Go back to the psychic source. And you might find that you were right. And her own intuition was right at the same time. Or you might find that you were wrong and you were totally reading her thoughts. And it's okay. It's okay to say, hey, I think I was wrong. I'm actually getting this now. The best thing you can do is explain to people, correct yourself, give the correct information, and just be honest and vulnerable and move on. My next tip is a little bit easier to do, especially if you have a lot of people that you are reading. And this is to not remember everything about a person's life. So say that you have a reoccurring person that comes to see you. I have a lot of those. And it's really important to not remember previous readings. I would not even take notes on the person besides maybe like their name, and that's it. But when you start to remember people and what happened in the last reading, what happens is it starts to bias your next readings, because you're referencing backwards and you're constantly trying to fit the new information into the old information. But really, a good psychic will always start with a clean slate, will always come to the psychic source to get new information, because it can always be changing. And obviously this is hard if you only have so many people you're reading, or even worse, if you have friends or family who you know what's going on in their personal lives. It can be really hard to keep that personal bias out of the way, which is why a lot of psychics say don't read your friends and family. I think there's a fine line there of, you can, but you really have to, again, set aside that bias and purposely try not to remember everything that's going on in their lives. But I think this is important, and a lot of people will come to me and it'll be like their fourth or fifth reading with me, and I won't remember what we talked about last time, and it feels rude. It feels rude to be like, oh, I don't remember your name hardly, or like what we talked about. But it's not personal. What it is you're trying to be the best you can be as a psychic. And I just say this to people when they're like, oh yeah, I remember my last reading. And I'm like, I read a lot of people, like, don't take it personally. It's probably better if I don't remember, because then I'm starting from a clean slate and I'm connecting to that psychic source. So it can be tempting, especially when the client encourages you to remember things about their life. But really try not to, because what it does is it only adds to your bias, which makes it a lot harder to remove that bias when you do want to connect and get information for them. So my next tip took me a few years to really understand, and that is to learn how to ask questions for your clients. And this one, when I was learning how to be psychic and I went to the Aspen program for psychic development, everyone there was a student. Everyone there wanted to learn how to be psychic. And we were taught pretty early on how to ask questions the right way. And the great thing about this is anytime someone was practicing, or I was practicing, my client knew how to ask a perfect question. But once you get out into reading other people, those people do not know how to ask questions the correct way. And I have a whole video on how to ask questions correctly, so check that out, because I'm not going to go over it in this video itself. But it's so important, because if they don't know how to ask the questions correctly and you're just asking the same thing, then you're not going to get very good answers. And I think it's actually a pretty big responsibility of psychics to know how to read between the lines, to ask the right questions for people, and use that to get them a better answer. And when I say read between the lines, sometimes people will they'll be rambling, or they'll try to ask a question, but really I can tell what they're trying to get at is something else. So even as they're asking me their question, I'm asking my guides, or I'm just using my own analytical mind to be like, what are they really trying to get at here? It sounds like what they actually want is this. And so I will go ahead and ask questions that they don't ask, to basically find that piece. Because sometimes they think they know why they're sitting down for a reading, but you have to use your intuition and you have to go where you're guided. I want to give you guys an example of this, and the best one that I can think of off the top of my head is when somebody calls me and they're desperate to connect to a loved one or a lost pet. It's kind of that desperate energy that's going on. And usually they want to know, like, what about this, and how did they die, and did this person do that? And they're kind of getting stuck on the wrong questions. And the real question is how can you calm down? How can you find peace? How can you not let these things bother you? Now, sometimes I won't ask that out loud, but I'll ask that for myself. And then sometimes I'll have to steer the conversation a little bit and be like, look, the how and the when and the why and all of these things that you're getting fixated on is not super important. What's actually important is understanding that you are really stressed out. You've got a lot of anxiety around this, and we need to work on that first. And so that's kind of what I mean about reading between the lines. And I hope that example helps. And if you guys have any examples of any of these, please leave them down below as well. Oh, and hey, if you like this video so far, give it a like. My next tip is, I've kind of already brushed on this one, but understanding that you are not responsible for the outcome. You are not responsible for this person taking this information and putting it into action. So obviously, I think most people know you're not supposed to just like follow up and be like, hey, did you do that thing? I've never had a psychic do that. But I think what happens is, in the middle of a reading, some psychics, feel responsible that their client is not accepting the information. So what do? They start over and they say, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'll just redo this whole reading so that you can feel better, if that makes sense. And I want to shake people when I see this, because what it's saying is that, okay, this client didn't like what they heard, and so I must be wrong, and I'm going to start from scratch because I care more about them feeling good and accepting the information than getting across the truth. I feel like this tip is the hardest for us introverts, and it still to this day will push me. I will get a client that just gets a little bit more intense, or I'll get somebody out of the blue who is constantly interrupting me and just like not listening to the information. And you can tell they just want to hear what they want to hear, but you really have to draw that boundary and be like, no, this is the information. I'm sorry you don't like it, but I'm not here to give you flowers and roses. I'm here to tell you what I receive. So the biggest thing here is to remember, don't seek validation. You're not going to get it sometimes from people, and don't feel responsible for the reading on if they took the information and acted on it or not. Sometimes people will listen to your reading and then do the exact opposite of what you say, and you might be right, but that is not your responsibility. So when you kind of have this as a base knowledge of, oh, okay, I don't, it doesn't matter to me what you do with this information. I am just here to deliver the information. My energy stops when this reading stops. Then it's a lot easier to not seek validation, to not get hung up on making them happy or giving them the exact perfect answer that they need to hear. At the end of the reading, you've given them what you're supposed to give them, but you are not responsible for following up on that information, for them acting on that information, or for them benefiting off that information. They are the ones who choose whether or not that information sits or not, if that makes sense. And this kind of comes back to the whole confidence thing. If you're constantly just like, oh, okay, yeah, let me redo your reading, I must have been wrong, then you're really saying, I don't trust myself. And you're letting that person walk all over you, and then you're draining yourself because you're going way longer than you should have. So really, it's not about you. Don't seek that validation. It's not about that. It's about just passing the information off and then moving on. My next tip for you guys is to remember not to read people who are desperate. And I've talked about this several times, but usually I have a rule of, if somebody seems very desperate, like they just lost their cat, they just lost somebody, they just got into a breakup, whatever it is, you do not want to read that person right then and there. I do not take emergency readings. I have a allotted time schedule, and it's there partly for that reason, so that people can't just be like, oh my gosh, I need you right now, call me up, blah, blah, blah. And the reason why I recommend not reading people who are desperate is because they are not in a space to hear you. It's just kind of a waste of both of your time. And a lot of times when people are desperate, they're too emotional. Even if you're giving them the most beautiful, perfect information that's coming through, they're not going to hear it because they're so emotional. And sometimes this affects their actions. Sometimes they'll interrupt you, they'll get angry towards you, they'll turn it into like somehow it's your fault. I don't know. There's a lot of reasons why we say, hey, calm down before you talk. When people contact me with that, I always kind of try to put them off and say, hey, my only availability is tomorrow. I'm so sorry. And you can say it like that so you're not the bad guy. Even if you don't have anything that you're doing. But it forces the other person to calm down and really make sure they want a reading, because sometimes they'll calm down and realize, you know what, I don't actually need a reading. I was just crazy emotional. And the best way to combat this is just to have something ready to say, like, hey, my next availability is Tuesday, I'm sorry. Or ask people to sign up through your website, because those are your only available days. You can also just be honest and say, hey, when I find that a pet has passed, sometimes just giving it a week really helps. And I kind of have a rule of just waiting 48 hours, 24 hours, whatever it is. And sometimes I think that that's helpful for people, because then if they really need to, they can set up an appointment, but then they can calm down. They should not be relying on you to relieve their emotions. They should be using their own stuff to have that. And what you can do also is create a PDF of here's what I recommend in the meantime. Here's a meditation to listen to in the meantime. So you still feel like you're actually helping them. But really try not to read them in that space. For an example, I made this mistake once, and I had this, it was sort of a friend, sort of an acquaintance from school, who called me up and was breaking up with her significant other, and she wanted to come over and get a reading within an hour. And I was so desperate for money that I was just like, sure, come over. And then it was awful because she didn't listen to anything I said. I was repeating myself over and over and over again. Thankfully, I knew the boundaries of I'm not going to change the information just to make you happy. This is what it says. This is what the cards say. This is what I'm getting. And so she wasn't listening. She was constantly interrupting me. And then on top of it, she ran way over an hour because she was so desperate and she wanted more because she wasn't satisfied. And nothing I was saying was actually helping her, because that's not what she needed at the time. She needed to go within. She needed to focus on herself and taking care of herself. And then on top of it, she didn't pay me the correct amount. And so it was all just this big mess. And then it left me so stressed out for the rest of the night, because I was, again, seeking that validation, because I was like, oh, I'm responsible for this. It was their relationship. And if I gave the wrong information, then it's going to break them up, or you know what I mean? So it just gets you into all sorts of trouble. So try not to do it. Put a 24-hour rule on it if you have to. It helps a ton. My next tip is also something I'm very bad at. And this is to not talk until you know what to say. And I loved this permission. This came from my mentor, and she really wanted us not to just blab, to fill the space because it was quiet or awkward. And I think it's really important, because sometimes you need to go back to the psychic source. Sometimes you need to reconnect. And you just need to not talk for a second. And that's totally okay. And I do think, being on the receiving end of readings, I love when people take the time to pause. It's like, ooh, what are they getting? You know what I mean? So really take it as permission if you need it. If you need to really pause and really reconnect, try not to talk until you know what you're going to say. And I think what happens, and this is a bad habit that I have myself, is that sometimes we feel like, oh, okay, I need to fill the space because they're paying me for my time. And if I'm not talking, then, they're just paying for silence on the other end of the phone, and that's not okay. But really what's going to happen otherwise is you're going to not connect correctly. You're going to give them the wrong information. So if you need to, please take the time to really make sure that you are getting something correctly before giving it. And like I said, I'm bad at this sometimes too. And this is why I have a list of things to remind myself of right before I go into a reading. So every time I go into a reading, I look at this list and I'm like, oh yeah, don't talk until you know what you're going to say. And I could tell you countless stories where I did this, but basically at the core, every time that it happened, I shifted into that left brain advice giving, that analytical mind, instead of connecting to the actual intuitive source. And it just made for a not as connected reading. I will say though that once you get practiced enough and once you're doing a ton of readings, sometimes it just comes so quickly and you've trusted it for so long that it's okay if it's fast, because sometimes channeling is very fast. Claircognizance itself is very quick. So don't take this as if you're being fast, you're being bad, because that's not the case. It's more when you're starting to shift into, giving the wrong advice or not really double checking before you give that intuitive advice, if that makes sense. Now the next one is pretty obvious, but this is to make sure that you are constantly staying on top of your boundaries and understanding how to be a healthy psychic. So this is making sure that you know how to remove blocks, that you are setting your boundaries before and after readings. I feel like we often skip over this, which is why I'm always so adamant about promoting it and putting it in all my basic stuff. Is because when you stop doing that, you're not a good reader. You don't understand the boundaries between you and somebody else. You might not be connecting to the right person. When you're not a healthy psychic, you won't show up the best that you can be, because you don't feel good. You're not taking care of your body. You're not taking care of your mind, your own personal stuff. All of that is incredibly important to being a psychic. And sometimes it's okay to just take a break. It's okay to say, hey, I'm going to take the week off so that I can focus on getting more sleep, catching up on sleep, on, eating healthy, whatever it is that you need at that time. Maybe you just need a mental break because you have a lot of stuff going on in life. It's incredibly important to do that so that you can be a clean and clear vessel for your clients. Oh, my dog is digging a hole. Ash! No! Yeah, I can see you. I think another part of this is also just remembering to live in the real world. I think that sometimes, I don't want to say psychics, but just people in general, they forget to go out and have fun and connect with friends and family, and all they do is kind of the work, and then they don't remember to take care of themselves in other areas of life. And so it can make for this disjointed imbalance, which makes it harder for you to connect to your psychic abilities. So absolutely remember to live in the real world, do things for yourself, have fun. Because when you're doing that, when you're giving yourself those needs, you're able to show up a lot better. I think you also need to get grounded in the real world sometimes and just get into that analytical mind a little bit, that left brain, do things that are not psychic related so you can really understand the difference of oh, this is psychic, this is not. All right, next tip. This is to make sure that you are doing all of the intuitive work for yourself. So you're not just reading other people, but you're reading yourself too. You're taking the advice that you give others by, meditating, doing your own spiritual practice, whatever that might look like for you, journaling, meditating, yoga, shamanic journeying, whatever it is, and making sure that, when you need help in life, that you're actually connecting to your intuition. And when you don't, maybe going and seeing a friend who's a psychic, or probably not a friend as much as just another psychic in general. And I think it's important, and this is something I didn't realize until a couple years of just not being very good at doing this, was I'm reading for everybody else and not myself sometimes. And sometimes I will forget to connect with even my own pets, and I realize it has been months since I've spoken to my own dog. And I think it's important to remember to do things for yourself so that you keep the joy and the fun in the actual work. Otherwise, it just turns into work. And you really want to make sure that you feel fulfilled by doing it, and you get the benefits that you're giving everyone else as well. And I find that when I stop and I kind of give that back to myself, if it's been a while, I feel like my readings improve so much because it encourages my curiosity again. I end up learning new things because I want to go out and, update, my toolbox of psychic skills, and because of that I become a better reader for everyone else, and I find my joy and my love of it again, instead of always being oh gosh, another reading, oh, I wish sometimes that maybe I just was doing a different job. But sometimes when we feel that way, it's because we're not giving it to ourselves, and we've lost the joy in it. And maybe it's because you're not reading for yourself and doing all those self-care things for you. I'll also throw in here too, this is like doing the psychic exercises daily. Like sometimes we just show up for the readings and then we don't do the practices in between because we think, oh, I don't need it, I'm good, I can connect with my ability like that now. And I definitely think that you can do that, and you can turn on your psychic ability at any time and trust that it's going to work, even if you haven't been practiced. But at the same time, it doesn't hurt to constantly be doing little psychic games throughout the day, so that you can constantly sit into that psychic mind, not just only when you're doing a reading for somebody else. That's how you learn things. That's how you connect with new guides and discover new ways of talking to them, discover new symbols that they might use. And I think it's important to just do this kind of work outside of reading other people, not just in that reading space. My next tip is to be willing to be wrong. This one is so hard for us, especially because we've been taught our whole lives that you can't be wrong. You have to be right all the time. And when you're understanding that, okay, I'm allowed to be wrong, I'm allowed to say, oh shoot, I'm sorry, I must be connecting wrong. It takes off the pressure so much. I can't even explain. And then okay, well, I'm just going to go in and trust what I get and say what I get and be confident. And if I'm wrong, then I'll be like, oh, sorry, I'm wrong. And it's not a big deal. I will share, for example, I got probably my first, it wasn't even a review, but like negative feedback from somebody last week. And when it happened, I realized I have not gotten a negative feedback from a reading in a long time. So it kind of humbled me. And I'm appreciative that I haven't gotten one in so long. But this person took the time to email me all the little tidbits of the reading that was incorrect. And I was just like, all right, thanks. Obviously, it bothered me a little bit more because of like how rude that kind of is, especially because I send out a disclaimer ahead of time that says, hey, I can be wrong. If it doesn't resonate, throw it away. But at the end of all of that, even though that was a little irksome, it's like I really wasn't bothered because I know I can be wrong. Like, this isn't a surprise to me. I know. And I even preface people on this. And so I think that can be just such a weight lifted off of you. And I think a lot of us hold ourselves to such a higher standard of like, oh, I cannot be wrong. And some people will respond back to an email like that of like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, let me give you a refund. Or, oh my gosh, let me completely redo your reading. And with people like that, you could do that reading 5 times over and they might just still not be happy. And then you're in this awful loop of getting sucked into their energy. Now, obviously, I will do that. Like, I will stop a reading and say, I'm sorry, I just don't think I'm connecting with you. Or, if somebody really, really, really would say something like, oh my gosh, this was such a waste of my time, like you didn't connect at all, you're awful, and like I really felt like I needed to give a refund, I would. I've never had that happen. But sometimes the fear of that can really block you from connecting to your psychic ability. So if you release the fear and accept the fear and say, it's gonna happen, then it's less of a fear and it gets in your way less as a reader. Also, with all of this, it just helps you to reaffirm and trust your psychic ability. Because if you let something like that get to you too much, you could throw yourself in a downward spiral and feel like, oh my gosh, I can't connect. And then you start to block yourself and you feel like, oh, I can't ever read again. So really, you have to think about it in the long term. You have to constantly take care of yourself and trust in that ability so you don't get all these psychic blocks of somebody else saying you were wrong. And my last tip for you guys is to constantly learn, try new things, and better yourself. Push yourself as a reader. I think it's incredibly important when you feel like you're stuck, when you feel like things are just so similar, to go out and try something new, to learn a new technique. Even if you don't decide to incorporate it into your readings, like getting information from somebody new and somebody different can just kind of shift your perspective. Even the tarot class that I'm doing right now, the teacher is probably not on the same like exact wavelength as I am, but I appreciate that. I appreciate somebody else's perspective of how, a tool works. And I might not agree with it, but that's okay because she's giving me new ideas that I wouldn't have thought about before myself. And when I say push yourself on readings, this is really about like trying to push yourself out of your comfort zone. Like if you've been doing email readings for the longest time and you really want to get on the phone or you really want to get in person, like try it, do it. Now there's a difference here of like, not wanting to do a certain way of reading because it just makes you super uncomfortable and it makes you a bad reader. Like, for example, I don't read at psychic fairs because there's just too much energy going on and it's not conducive for me. There's a difference between understanding your comfort zone and then hiding in your comfort zone. So every now and then, try to push yourself, try to do something different, try to do something new. And it could even be during a not paid reading. You know, you could just be doing this for a friend on the side. Alrighty, you guys, those are my tips on how to be a better reader. Whether you're just a beginner, you can still use these tips and kind of keep them in the back of your mind, so you don't develop those bad habits later. Or if you're kind of a more advanced intuitive, of really trying to push yourself and really get yourself out of your comfort zone on areas that you might have been slacking in. And I feel like I do this too. There's no judgment here. Sometimes I slack in some of these areas and I have to constantly remind myself to do better. And I think what happens is when you do better, it affects your readings. You get better reviews. You know, people trust you more and you get more referrals. And, you know, that's not the whole goal, but at the same time, if you feel like you're just not getting anywhere, you feel like your readings are the same, you feel like you're stuck, you feel like you hate your clients, there's probably something else there that you could be working on yourself to kind of make that a little bit better. Even if it's just explaining your process a little bit more up front. And that is something that I do also discuss in part 3 of my basic psychic skills course, as well as like how to deal with like specific people. I have read so many different types of people that I can kind of put them in a general list and like explain how they approach readings, how they act during readings, and how you can respond to them. And I feel like this is what causes a lot of people to stop doing readings, because they think, oh, it's me, you know, I'm doing something wrong, I'm attracting all these bad people. But really it's just a wake-up call of, hey, I need to understand how to handle this. And once you do, it's like you can handle any type of reading. And I will say that there are some that still get me and I have to go and vent to my husband and be like, oh my gosh, this person just did this, how rude. And that will still happen. But if you want to check that out and see all those different types of people and kind of get some advice on how to handle that, definitely look at part 3 of my basic psychic skills course. If any of you that are readers have any other tips you want to share, please do so in the comments below. This is just kind of a combination of what I learned from my mentor and then what I learned from multiple years of doing this. But I would love to hear other pieces of advice that you guys might have of being a better psychic reader. Alrighty, you guys, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye.